So far, Aristotle has told us very little about the actual governing structure of his ideal city state, his ideal constitution. He's told us that the ideal constitution will be aimed at the contemplative life, or it makes no small difference what we take happiness to be. The ideal constitution will get that question right. And so its affairs are somehow going to be arranged towards enabling contemplation among the citizens. Okay, but that's still, what exactly does that look like? How exactly does governance happen? Who governs? How do they govern? He's told us stuff about the limits to the size of the city state. It can't be too big, can't be too small. Okay, and we saw the reasons for that. But what exactly will the government, so to speak, look like? What form will it take? Is there going to be a king? Is it going to be a democracy? Is there going to be just a handful of people who rule? So far, he hasn't said anything. He turns to that question later in Book 7. He says that in the ideal political community, you will see political rule. That's what he calls it. And he contrasts political rule. Political rule is something that he discusses in a variety of places. And in other places, he contrasts it with monarchical rule, tyrannical rule, things like that, right? It's not like that. It's not just one person kind of lording it over other people. Rather, political rule is ruling and being ruled in turn. That's his phrase. That's what we're going to find in the ideal political community. The citizens will rule, so they will rule others and be ruled in turn. That's what the governing structure is going to be like. But that's kind of unclear. And in most of Aristotle's discussion, he just kind of leaves it like that. Most of his discussions of political rule, when he mentions that phrase, he just, rule and being ruled in turn, political rule. In 714, he specifies what exactly that means. Now, the way 714 is actually an often overlooked chapter of the politics, even by specialists in Aristotle. They just don't pay attention to it for whatever reason. And even so, specialists in Aristotle will interpret political rule to mean something like, well, I rule one year, you rule the next year, I rule this year, you rule the next, or whatever, right? We just take turns going back and forth. And that's kind of what it looks like it means, right? Rule and be ruled in turn means we just take turns, right? You rule, then I rule, then I rule, then you rule, whatever, right? So is that what Aristotle means? A lot of commentators, specialists in Aristotle, people who write on Aristotle, philosophy professors who write on Aristotle, take him to mean something like that when he talks about political rule. That is not what Aristotle means, however. And 714 makes this clear. 714 is when he describes what exactly political rule will look like in the ideal city-state, the ideal political community. It's not that. It's not just taking turns, right? What Aristotle says is that nature itself has settled who should rule and who should be ruled. And when. When should I rule? When should you rule? When, whatever. That's his idea. Nature itself has settled this question for us. Because what Aristotle says is that nature is divided. Well, I mean, he didn't say it quite like this, but nature has divided us into young and old. And younger people are fit to be ruled. And older people are fit to rule. In the best constitution, there's going to be political rule, which means the citizens will rule and be ruled in turn. And what that means in practice is that the older citizens will rule and the younger ones will be ruled. One of the things that Aristotle says in a different discussion of political rule is that in order to learn how to rule, you must be ruled. And so part of what's happening here is the younger people who don't have the requisite experience, practical experience to rule yet, right? By being ruled, by seeing how it is that their elders are making decisions and so on, right? They're learning how to rule. That's kind of Aristotle's idea. They're acquiring the requisite experience as they age. And so in the best constitution, the older citizens rule while the younger ones will be ruled. Something like that is his idea. Now, what I want to close with is what this means for what the best constitution will look like, or more generally, the kinds of questions that we might have. What kind of constitution is it going to be? One thing, when often enough when we think about, well, what kind of constitution do you have? We think of that in terms of, is it going to be a monarchy or a democracy or a blah, 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 whatever, right? And Aristotle doesn't really approach it in that way. He makes those divisions in various places, but when he himself starts discussing what the best constitution and ideal political community will look like, he doesn't approach it in that way. He doesn't approach it in terms of saying, well, it's going to be a monarchy, or it's going to be a democracy, or it's going to be this or that. But I think what he has to say about political rule actually keys us into what he must think about the proper governing structure of the ideal community. And this also kind of is going to afford us a chance to kind of, to reflect on his political theory more generally. So, kind of review. In the best constitution, all people will be happy. We know that, right? In the best constitution, the best political community, all of the citizens, all of the people are happy. They are all engaging in virtuous, rational activity. All the people are virtuous, and they all have the opportunity to act on their virtues, right? That's what it is for it to be the ideal political community. Part of what this means, according to Aristotle, and we've kind of talked about this, is that laws and institutions and unwritten social expectations, I should have put that up there too, unwritten social expectations, customs, mores, whatever, are going to encourage virtue in the citizens, right? That's what this whole community, the whole reason we came together is so that we all might act virtuously together, right? So that we all might flourish and live good lives together, right? So everything's going to be ordered toward that. Recall what we had said about political distributive justice. Office or honor or political power, political liberty, political rights, Aristotle claims, should be distributed according to merit. And the relevant merit is virtue. The more virtuous someone is, the more political power or office that person should have. That's Aristotle's view. And we talked about the reasons for that, because that's how we best ensure the common good. That's how we best ensure that everybody is able to act virtuously. Everyone's able to be virtuous and then act on that virtue, right? Well, if all of the people in the ideal political community are virtuous, well, then they all have a rightful claim to office, to rule, right? If they're all virtuous, well, then they all should rule, right? Political power should be distributed according to virtue. All these people are virtuous. They all should have political power. That's political distributive justice, according to Aristotle. Well, that entails then that the ideal political community is going to be something like a self-governing democracy. It's going to be a democracy in which all of the citizens have political power, right? A monarchy would be a constitution in which just one person has political power. And maybe they delegate to other people or whatever, but political power really rests with one person, the king or queen. A democracy, by contrast, all the citizens have power. Well, that's what Aristotle is saying the ideal political community will look like. All of the people are going to have power, and they are going to govern themselves, right? There's not going to be a distinct kind of ruling class. No, the citizens rule themselves. Now, I say it's a kind of self-governing democracy because, as we've just seen, when he talks about political rule, when he talks about citizens ruling themselves and being ruled in turn, his idea is that it's not going to be a democracy in the sense that everyone over 18 can vote or whatever, right? Or that everyone over 18 will be a ruler. Because he wants to say, no, 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 no. Rule is going to be confined to a particular period of your life, namely when you're older, when you've had the requisite experience, then you are fit to rule, right? And so it's going to be a democracy in that sense. So not every citizen will be ruling, but every citizen will have the opportunity in their lifetime to rule, right? So when you're younger, when you're 25 or something, you're not old enough yet. You need the experience. So you're not ruling yet, but then you're older and you become a ruler. Now, last thing I want, and so this gives us I think, a very good sense of the political theory and of how it all, so to speak, comes together, how happiness, community, justice all come together in his political theory. We could also throw friendship in here. He doesn't talk about it in book 7 very much, but we've talked about it. Political friendship, unanimity, agreement about what the good of the community is and what we need to do to achieve that, right? That's going to be woven into this picture as well. And so we're going to have justice, community, happiness, friendship, all coming together in this ideal political community. The last thing that I want to mention now is a kind of speculation. One of the things that we were just talking about in a previous video was this idea that happiness really is the contemplative life. And what we're talking about now with the best constitution doesn't seem to talk about contemplation at all, right? We're supposed to set that up as kind of the goal. Everything's directed towards that. But now when we get to the actual structures of the Constitution, it's just, well, young people, I think he said, you serve in the military and so on, and you kind of do the hard work or whatever. And then old people, they're more fit to be directing that work, directing the military, directing the younger people. But none of that mentions contemplation. Who's contemplating? Are they all contemplating? What is going on? Contemplation seems to have kind of dropped out of the picture. The politics, and so I want to just address this very quickly. What is the place of contemplation in all this? The politics, that book, that work, is incomplete. It just cuts off. So we have book 7 that we've read from. If we would have kept reading, if we would have gone into book 8 starts talking about leisure, how we should spend our leisure time. And it cuts off in the middle. And so he, in book 8, he starts talking about how we should spend our leisure time. And he starts talking about attending plays and things like that, right? Plays were very big in ancient Greece. And he starts talking about those kinds of things. And then it cuts off. He doesn't get very far. It's my speculation that what he would eventually go on to talk about, that if we ever find the rest of book 8, or if there are subsequent books, book 9, 10, whatever, my speculation is that he begins to talk about contemplation. Contemplation is the most important of the leisure activities. When Aristotle does discuss contemplation in book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he mentions it as something you do during your leisure time. It's a leisure activity. And so my speculation is that in book 8, he would have, after talking about plays and maybe something else, I don't know, he would have gone on to talk about contemplation, to talk about how that really is the most important kind of leisure activity. And my further speculation would be that what he's painting for us here is a kind of progression of of how we're supposed to, of what virtues are going to be pertinent to the citizens as they age. And so you start off with the younger people who are going to have character virtues like courage and temperance and need to develop them further, right? And you send them into war and exercise their courage and so on. And they develop the character virtues. Over time, with experience, they develop what Aristotle calls practical wisdom. And that's the virtue of a ruler, Aristotle says. And so having lived some life, they've developed practical wisdom. Now they're fit to rule, say in their 50s or so. Having ruled, having lived longer, having learned more, having spent a generous portion of their life seeing to the maintenance of their political community in the form of serving as soldiers or serving as workers or whatever it might be, in the form of ruling the political community, making decisions for it. Having spent a generous portion of their life in service to the city state, now they are free of those kinds of obligations once they're much older, right? In their, I don't know, 60s, 70s, 80s, 70s. And they're wise enough. They've learned enough. They have understanding to live the contemplative life, right? And so you get this kind of progression. I speculate, Aristotle never says this, but right, a life devoted to character virtues, a life devoted to rule, practical wisdom, a life devoted to wisdom, the philosophic contemplative life, which citizens would would have the leisure to enjoy in their twilight years. That's the ideal constitution, according to Aristotle. That's what we ought to be aiming at when we think about how our own institutions are structured and what we're hoping for from our political community.